How would you define happiness?
How would I define happiness? It changes a little bit depending upon who I've talked to in the last few months. But I kind of tend to define happiness as the absence of needing anything more. So I kind of have a negative understanding of happiness in a sense. And the reason I say that is that I've recently spoken to a guy called David Bather-Woods, who's a Schopenhauer expert. And Schopenhauer's a pessimist. He's very negative about things. And he defines it as being that state of essentially not being in suffering, not wanting anything. And I think there is something to be said for that happiness is that kind of moment of wherever you are, that sudden realization that everything I have right now is what I need. And everything I have right now is making me content. And I think that sense of gratitude, of limit, and of kind of acceptance, I think is a huge element of happiness. I think, is it Benjamin Franklin once said, it might not be him, we can add it in the show notes, said, that comparison is the thief of joy. I think there's something to be said for that, that ability of, looking over the fence, and looking at someone else's garden and thinking what they have is great. That is the thief of joy. So being able to accept and let what you have and what the moment is right now deepen, I think that's what happiness is, really. Long answer, rambling answer, sorry.
No, you've studied so much philosophy, and right now, as we sit in 2025, that comparison is probably more than ever, right? So do you think we lack that contentment because there is so much more comparison to what you've probably read that was going on hundreds of years ago?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, I think, because there is the happiness industry now, isn't there? And there is an idea of, which is kind of like in this kind of post-Freud emotional kind of literate and emotional incontinent age, that we can talk about happiness and joy so much, and that if anything in life is not making you happy, whatever that might be, ditch it, change your path, or do something different. And I think that I don't want to rag on social media, but it's also on TV and in movies. The idea that if you haven't got this certain path or this certain way, then you aren't happy. Of course, that feeds what I was talking about earlier. That feeds a dissatisfaction with what you do have, and the idea that happiness is entirely tailored to every individual in the world. And so what if somebody telling you what they think their happiness is ought to be your model, I think you should always look at that with a certain degree of cynicism. But the problem, of course, is that there is so much what psychologists call projection here. That if people feel as though their life is happy or is the right way, that therefore if your life doesn't mirror theirs, you must be unhappy. Do you know what? It's something I've seen in parenting quite a lot, actually. Parenting is an incredibly fraught, kind of passionate area of debate. And because I've got 2 kids myself, and with my first son, we did breastfeeding. Second son, we did kind of bottle feeding. And in both cases, if you tell people that you did one or the other, it implies that what they've done with their kids is somehow wrong. And of course, no one wants to be called a bad parent. And I think something similar is happening with happiness. That if I say to people, like, I'm quite content in my house with my banger of a car, with, like, small salary, whatever, and somebody else comes along and say, well, don't you want more money? Don't you want to go on these expensive holidays, 5-star hotels? Well, mate, that's for you, possibly. That's your happiness. But, the projecting of your happiness onto somebody else's is difficult. So I think that, that degree of contentment and making peace with your own definition. But the fact we're having this conversation, I think, is important to happiness in itself. You mentioned before we came on to record that, you and your friend have talked about happiness in the past. I think those kind of conversations, clarify what you want from life. But I think that the idea that we need to be constantly happy all of the time, it's odd, isn't it? And like, what does that even mean? Like, happiness as an affect. I'm feeling joy, like some kind of like orgasmic level of delight all of the time. I mean, the brain. I mean, even the basic understanding of the brain, it doesn't work like that. The brain isn't meant to be constantly experiencing pleasure and happiness all of the time. So if you're talking about happiness as that kind of brain affect, then it's obviously not that. And so I think happiness is a kind of a label or a ribbon that we put around a stage of our life, or a collective experience of our lives, or even like an understanding of what we want from life. And then we say, that is what happiness is. And I think that's why it's obviously hard to grasp and to talk about, because it changes from person to person, and because it's often understood in hindsight, and because it's often a collection of experiences and parts of your life, which will also include hardship and suffering and trials. And I know your past is in athletics and in sports, and that's the classic example of that. The 5 a.m. running outside in the hail is part of the happiness bundle that makes up being a successful athlete. If you took that out, for example, if you said to an Olympian, I could just put you with a magic click of my fingers, give you a magic wand or something, whatever, and put you on the podium with a gold medal around your neck, would that be the same as investing 5 years of your life doing the hard hours and missing your mate's wedding and your dad's funeral, whatever, to be an Olympian? It's different. It's probably not. And likewise, you could get a helicopter to the top of Mount Everest, can't you? What's the point in that sense?
That's a great analogy, getting a helicopter up to Everest. I think from what I've seen, and I agree with the parenting thing, I actually spend a lot of time around parents, even though I'm not one and I don't have a horse in the race yet. I would say that the idea of what is happy has been confused and it's been complicated. And if you really look around at those people who are content and happy in what they're doing, there is a real simplicity to it as well. And again, I am in Spain right now, and I see that around. I see more ability to be content in the present moment than other countries such as England or maybe America and Australia that I've been to. And I think it's due to its simplicity here, the simplicity of culture, the simplicity of and even the depth of the conversation as well, which we'll get onto. But do you think there's a difference, or do you think that contentment and happiness are the same?
Yeah, I probably do. I'm aware that's the problem is that word content is so boring. It's an emotional blancmange, isn't it? It's beige, isn't it? To say that are you happy, mate? Well, I'm content. That implies that you're kind of like, you're trying to like cope, aren't you? You're trying to justify your life. I'm content. I'll die soon. I'm fine with what I have. But yeah, I mean, content for me is a kind of deepening. It's a kind of contentment in what you have and satisfaction in what you have. The difficulty, of course, is where you place ambition within this, because contentment implies that you're never going to change what you have, and well, first, I think that I don't think humans will ever reach a period where they are content. You don't just sit in the bar forever and think, right, this is me, done, I'm happy. I'm content. There is an element of constantly striving and moving forward and changing and stuff. But I think, that contentment exists within a certain paradigm, a certain kind of like self-defined limit of what you consider to be happy. And, if that's defined by being around your friends or earning money, that's fine. Because that's everything, of course. People like to rag on careers and money as being kind of like, you never get to your deathbed and think, I wish I worked more. But that isn't necessarily true. Some people do enjoy work. Some people do enjoy earning money. Some people earn, either in itself for money so you can buy other things, or as a game token. Basically, I know someone in my life who's, rich beyond anyone needs to be rich, and they say to me, I view it now as just like tickets on the game. It's just like the money's going up, and it's just and he seems to be happy in that, and fine, that's your ticket to happiness, it's not mine. But I think ambition can exist within self-set kind of targets, and I think that, and again, I don't want to make the analogies to athletics just because you're into athletics and sports, but I'm a runner and I love running, and I enter 10k and half marathon races about my distance, really, and I'm well aware that I'm not going to become an Olympian, I'm not going to win the race, but it's entirely within what I consider to be good for me. And I'm happy within that kind of like self-set target and what I have. And if I don't get it, I might be disappointed, but I'll try it again. But I think that's a lot of it. But I mean, these are kind of thoughts percolating in the background of my mind, because I'm very attracted to this idea of being content with your lot and finding peace in gratitude and acceptance. And I am also aware that there needs to be some space for ambition and for growth, so that those two are in some respects, contradictory. How do you grow? How do you have ambition? How do you become better, as well as accepting and being content with what you do have? And oscillating between the two is somewhere what happiness happiness is found, I think. Sorry, I'm rambling. I have a tendency to do this. I just philosophize
ramble
out
away.
loud.
You're amongst a peer in rambling. So
Good.
but what you talk about is the ambition part is really resonates, because just as a professional athlete, right, you are ambitious. It's almost like baked into your experience, right? I don't really know many professional athletes that have done it by accident, but your ambition to get there can sometimes get conflicted with other people's ambitions, especially if you're in a team sport, right? There is kind of your own personal ambition and then the ambition of others. But I would say now the idea of being happy just through the conflicting, or the not even conflicting, but just the amount of information and messaging that's out there right now, is that you just see so many people that in order to be happy and content, you must have this, you have to have this, and this should be your goal and ambition. And I don't see enough people, whether it's young or maybe older, having done a more introspective look at going, what is my ambition? What is my level of happiness? And even in people that I know who have done that questioning and maybe have found an answer for themselves, it is still an ongoing, forever firefighting of the opinions of others and the ideas of others, that you may think this is what makes you happy, but actually over here is what could make you happy or happier.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so difficult because humans, we are wired to be social beings, and the idea that we, don't do what anyone else wants of you, don't listen to peer pressure, don't do what other people expect of you. That's not necessarily, that's not how humans work. I mean, that's a sociopath who does that. So when you talk to somebody, it's really difficult not to play their game. If they say to you, how's your job doing, or are you happy and stuff, you want to answer in a way which satisfies their life as well. And I've had this as well. I want to reach a stage where if somebody's bragging about their career or how much they've earned, or, whatever, or how good their kids are at school, whatever, I want to reach a stage where I can just smile and say, well, that's great for you, mate. But maybe I'm not there yet. I'm not wise enough. I'm not deep enough. But I find myself being pulled into the competition, the battle. I wanted to say, oh yeah, well, I've got a pretty good car myself. It's over there, you see. Yeah, my kid's getting pretty good grades as well, kind of thing. And it's so hard not to see the ridiculousness of this kind of like competitiveness in the happiness space. When I think most people when they go home and think it, they'll think, why the heck did I do that? Why was I trying to have a bragging competition with a lawyer in London? It's about money. What was the point? And then you kind of go away and you feel a bit dirty afterwards, like if you're eating the KFC bucket or something.
I've heard you say that happiness is a smiling soul rather than a smiling face. What do you mean by that?
So that's got quite a lot of attention on. So that's recently been commented actually on YouTube. Sorry, been posted on YouTube by my company, Big Think, and a lot of the comments are about that. And the reason why I mention that, use that phrase, is because that's what Aristotle, who's a Greek philosopher, literally uses that expression. It's called eudaimonia, which is of a good spirit. And I think the reason why I use that is, well, two reasons really. One is because there is a certain intangible, subjective degree to kind of happiness, and that and so when I talk about a soul, it does live in that kind of wishy-washy, mystical, religious space, which most people can't understand. But I do think the idea of happiness, if it exists at all, has to exist within that space, that kind of slightly hard to articulate. If someone says to you, are you happy? And you say yes, I think the next question is, why are you happy? Is always going to be difficult to answer. Because it occupy, in my mind, a similar space to religion and faith and belief and spirituality and things, in the sense that there is often just because you can't express it doesn't necessarily mean it's not true or important in your life. And I think happiness is a bit like that. And the second reason why I say it's good. What did I say? It was a smiling soul, didn't I? I was directly comparing it with the idea of a smiling face, a smiling smile, because as I mentioned in that video, we, for better or worse, we carry around certain images of what happiness means, and it means literally smiling. It means being on the beach. It means being with friends and stuff like that. And there's something in the UK. I don't know if it's what I call resting bitch face. If you know about this, where people have this face where they look really miserable, but they're not. They're just happy. They're just sitting there, just like enjoying the world. And I don't have one of these, but I know a lot of my friends do. And I look at them and say, "You're all right. Yeah, I'm just really happy, just relaxed in the moment," because their natural, kind of body, their natural disposition is just to look like they're miserable, but actually they're in a very deeply spiritually contented place. And I think there is a deepening which happens when you aren't worried about what people are what people think about you. You can just relax into that happiness. So not a good answer for a good question, but it was a good question.
I'm a qualified yoga teacher. A few years ago, I was teaching yoga, and one of the experiences I had when you teach is something at the end of a yoga class is the students are in shavasana, which is just literally lying. Sometimes it's sitting, and they might be meditating. Very meditative part the class. But there is an experience as a teacher, and this has helped me hugely with my public speaking, is that when you are teaching this, you are teaching something that is only through giving. You are just giving these people, trying to give them an experience that helps them, guides them. But you cannot stop getting caught up. And you're trying to make them happy, in inverted commas, right? You're trying to make them happy and peaceful and content. But you cannot help yourself getting caught up in their faces and trying to see the contentment and the happiness that you're trying to give them in the expressions on their faces. And so many people looked miserable. And then I would suddenly second guess myself, going, oh my God, is the experience no good? Is it not working? What's going on? Have I got this wrong? And then you would kind of get through that period, and then you would finish the class and everyone would come and talk to you, and people go, oh my God, that was just one of the most amazing things. And I was like, could you just tell your face? And it was a really great lesson for me in terms of the outward expression of an individual doesn't necessarily match the internal experience that they're having. And sometimes that goes the other way, right? Someone can present an experience that they are happy, but the internal experience could be completely opposite. And so it was just a huge perspective shift for me, that you never really judge someone's contentment and their happiness based on the external factors of them.
Absolutely, yeah. And it works both ways, of course, doesn't it? Because people will know that you are a yoga teacher, and you've said that as well, and they will want to also let you know that they are having a good time. So they might also put on a big beaming smile to let you know, yeah, I'm having a great time. Lovely class, really like it. And then, they'll go home and they'll also internalize that idea that if they're not smiling, if they're not laughing, it's there for a bad time. It's a false dichotomy to say that if you're not happy, you're therefore suffering and you're miserable. There's a whole spectrum of very complicated emotions in between. And in fact, the I could put the name of Barrett, Elizabeth, I think, Emma Feldman Barrett, she's a psychologist, and she talks about this idea of emotional granularity. And this is the idea that if when we teach kids, essentially there are a few basic emotions. You have happiness, sadness, anger, and everything has to be squashed into one of those three. But actually, the more words you have to identify your emotions, the better you are at experiencing them and recognizing them in yourself. So obviously, within happiness, you have a whole family resemblance of similar happy words. You have joy, you have delight, you have, I said, contentment earlier. You have kind of, I don't know, ecstasy, and then you have a whole range in between. So, and the happiness, where does it fit within that? Is it the collective label for all of those? Emotions are very complicated, and the happiness that somebody might feel in your yoga class is very different to a happiness that they might feel cuddling their children, or I don't know, winning a race, or after just having sex, whatever. They're different feelings, but yet in some language, particularly English, in some ways there's a paucity of words to identify those, and therefore to identify your own feelings.
Have we confused happiness with just not being sad?
Well, yeah, I think so, and the never-ending game, or the never winnable game, I guess, in the sense that you can never be too happy. I mean, Immanuel Kant talks about this, that it kind of ties into that question you asked about earlier about a smiling soul, that if you measure happiness by any tangible thing on earth, any empirical thing like money, or even having children, or power, or success, where there will always be more, because we are not, we're not Thanos. We haven't got infinity stones, so there'll always be more money to have. Even Musk could get more money. Even that some person who's got like 17 kids could have more kids. There is, so happiness cannot be measured by material, physical things, because you could, by that metric, always have more, and therefore you can never be happy. And that's the other thing that we're not necessarily dancing around here, that we haven't really considered here, is that maybe happiness doesn't exist. That the word happiness is so kind of absent of meaning now, is so vague and incoherent that it doesn't even make sense to talk about happiness. And I have sympathy for that view, to be honest. That the fact that we're having so much conversation, the difficulty discussing it right now, it implies that possibly the word itself is not useful in our language game discussing here. In a similar way to religious concepts, in some respect, that when people talk about God, everyone's got their own images of God, and maybe with happiness something similar is happening there. But the difference is, sorry, I'm doing this thing where I'm using you as a springboard just to philosophize my own thoughts. The difference is, of course, is that people feel happiness. People have moments of peak experiences, what William James called peak experiences. These moments of kind of like, wow, life is brilliant. You talked about flow state earlier, that kind of feeling of kind of like at oneness with things, mystical, religious, peak experiences, whatever you want to call it. Those moments do kind of punctuate most people's lives. And so therefore, constantly trying to reclaim those moments or recreate your life in such a way that invites more of those moments seems to be an admirable pursuit. But what you're doing with yoga teaching is an example of that. You give people a space by which they might have an experience, which is some mystical or spiritual happy experience. So maybe life is like that. You got to basically try to create the scenario in which you could have more of those. But sorry, edit this all out. It's all buff.
It's gold. I don't teach yoga anymore. That was what I was doing in the past, and I haven't done it for a while. But it was just an experience that taught me a lot about the experience of others. We were talking pre-recording that I had listened to especially your 3 pillars of happiness.
Oh yeah.
And then I sort of really thought about it myself. And we can talk about your 3 pillars, but I wanted to throw my sort of own, I guess, my own theory of happiness, even if it's just for myself, but I just wanted to throw it there, which was, I thought of happiness for me, and I really delved into when was I at my most happy. And you'd even spoken before, and you've sort of danced around it a little bit here, where you talk about there being challenging moments in your life, some of the most sort of objectively unhappy moments of your life, actually, in retrospect, can be some of the greatest times that you've had. And I think of my own personal journey in my life, and I thought, when was I really happy? When was I truly happy? And it was in those moments where there was an element of challenge. So I threw challenge as a sort of part of it, because I also brought the idea of flow into my idea of happiness, of being in this state of flow. And with that, you're joyful when you're in flow, right? You are joyful. It's something that you are enjoying it. But there is a challenge that's involved. There's something that's stimulating you. It feels like you're stretching, but you're not snapping. And then for me, there's an effort that goes with that. An effort. So it's this sort of like effortlessness that kind of is this beautiful balance in a flow state and a joyful experience. But all of that kind of doesn't really matter if you don't feel like you've got the capabilities to deal with it, to manage it, to get through it. And I think potentially, if we think of right now in the world, that the word overwhelm is a big thing, that many people potentially feel overwhelmed because they are not capable of dealing through the situation. The challenge is maybe too much for them, and maybe there isn't enough effort being put in, or maybe they're over-striving with effort. So, yeah, those were my 3 sort of
I think it's
theories.
It's a great theory, and it obviously it chimes in really well with Buddhism as well, and what Schopenhauer was saying earlier, that if we're measuring happiness as being kind of like a challenge or a desire overcome, then it makes sense to have those moments in your life, those challenges and things. And I can't remember. There's a book called Homo Ludens, and there is a school of philosophy which argues that humans are one of the few species, or if not the only species, who invent challenges for ourselves to then overcome. There was a meme I saw only yesterday. It was like a Japanese game show where they were on a treadmill, and there were like these cutouts came up to them, and they had to jump up the trampoline to make the body shape to go through the cutout. Does that make sense?
Yes,
as it's going along. And then the comment underneath it was that what other species create challenges that they can overcome in this way, and there's a degree of rule making. It's essentially it's like a game, isn't it? Like when we play Monopoly or we make Snakes and Ladders, we have certain rules that we have to stick within, and we have to overcome it. And if we win, hooray, we win. And so, which is entirely logical. If we've worked out that being happiness or pleasure, even, it comes from satisfying a desire or overcoming a challenge, then let's give ourselves more manageable challenges along the way that we can overcome, so therefore we will be happy. That makes entire sense. And I have a lot of sympathy with your view. Actually, I think there is a lot to that. And also there's a degree of pride with the overcoming of a challenge as well. In fact, Viktor Frankl talks about this in his book Man's Search for Meaning. He says that some of the problems in modern society is that we don't allow ourselves to, take pride in particularly, existentially difficult moments, the depression, anxiety, feeling overwhelmed, or moments of extreme stress that we then come out the other side of, which we all do. Those of us who are still living have come out the other side of it. We have another day. And so that, there is a degree of pride in just kind of like getting by and getting over things. And that is accepting that, I think is good as well. Again, it comes to acceptance and gratitude, really, in that respect.
It was so, I'll tell you something that's really interesting is that a question I ask people all the time that are going through a challenge, and if they come to me and say, I've got this challenge, I'm not sure what to do, I don't know which way to turn. Unanimously, this one question that I throw back at them always finds the answer, which is, if you were to look back on this moment that you're going through in a year's time, and you were to be proud of yourself for handling it, what would you do? And I promise you, they find the answer so fast. And they also never choose, well, I'm going to lie down and just wait for it to go over me and just go through it. Very often it is, I'm going to face this challenge with some sort of courage and bravery, or I'm going to find a way in which I need to learn the skills or knowledge to get through it. And I'm going to come out of it a better, more knowledgeable, experienced person. And it's incredible how you can use pride in yourself as a motivator to do things for yourself, even if they aren't pleasurable.
Yeah, and I agree. And interesting, use that word motivator. I think that's hugely important. That catalyst, that invitation to often reframe a situation is very important. I have sympathy with the French existentialists in the respect, who basically argue that we have an incredible power over our own life, more so than we even think. Not just in terms of getting out of bed and doing something or changing our life situation, but also in how we see the world and how we see ourselves and how we see what are the meaning in our life. And it sounds like what you're offering people there is an opportunity to reframe situations, and sometimes that reframing does open up a motivation to take control of those aspects of our lives. And this is not new wisdom. The Stoics are talking about this as well. They talk about the idea that we do have control. Essentially you either have to accept what you can't change and change what you can. And I like that. I think that's a true element of Stoicism, really. But I will steal your definition of happiness and claim it as my own next time.
But your 3 pillars of happiness, talk us through those.
So the first one is, as you mentioned there, really, essentially is this idea that, happiness cannot be measured by just pure hedonic units, but pleasure, really. So you don't just sit there at the end of the day and say, right, how many moments of pleasure did I have? I drank a coffee, that was quite nice. Okay, I went for a nice walk, that was quite nice. You don't add it up and then say, well, I'm happy or not happy and stuff. Well, some people might, but it seems to be a very shallow definition of happiness. So happiness, in a sense, is, as you mentioned earlier, is a degree of overcoming. It's suffering. It's also existential meaning, which often involves moments of hardship and pain, and often, absolute nadir experiences, depression, anxiety, mental health crises, whatever. They are involved in the package of a life. And I can't remember who said it. I should have revised more before coming on this podcast. Was that call no man happy until the day he dies, or something like that. Because it's only with the benefit of hindsight that you look back at seeing the winding path that led up to these moments of peak happiness. I would like to say that most people, 99.9% of people, can look back at their lives and point to moments in their life which they would consider to be peak happinesses. And of course, no one's life is dropped in at any moment. You're not dropped in as a student at university. You're not dropped in when you meet your partner. You're not dropped in when you have kids, whatever. There is a path which leads to those moments. And so it's only when you look back can you see the path which led to those peak experiences. And if you say to somebody, often the case, it's particularly true of my life, I've got to be careful I don't project my own experience onto other people. But, if you said to me, I would get rid of these hard parts of this path, the thorny parts, the marshy parts, the boggy parts, but it would mean that you don't have these kids. It would mean you don't meet your wife, or it would mean you don't, meet those friends at university. Would you take it? For me, no. My deal with fate is okay, that I would take the hardship to bring up to where those peak experiences. And so happiness cannot be measured by pleasure alone, but rather essentially the journey, the package, which will involve hardship, which will involve a lot of suffering. I think that's the first pillar. Sorry, did you want to come in on that?
Well, only just as soon as you say that, and again, I've heard you speak about the many highways or the roads to happiness, and I think of my own experiences, and again, I'm not going to try and do what we maybe fear doing, is placing our own experiences onto other people, but we can only live from lived experience, right? And
yes.
I think of the most proud moments of my life, everything that I'm proud of myself of doing and even becoming, and I don't say that in some sort of arrogant, overconfident way, is that it is through knowing that the challenges I overcame and the rocky roads that I went through have made me happy, were happy either at the end of them, during that journey. And for me, just knowing that even in decisions I take moving forward, trying to seek more happiness, pleasure, that actually, if it's frictionful and it's got some sort of challenge into it, that I should probably lean into it, because I feel like at the end of it that it's going to pay off through past experience. But you don't know that at the time. And even this trip that I've got to Spain, right, I came here really without really knowing, and I didn't really know what it was going to hold for me, and I didn't know, but I leaned into my intuition on it, and my intuition was telling me more to come here, and I think it's going to pay off. I think there's things that have happened since I've been here that are definitely going to pay off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess there are almost two strands, aren't there? That there is the first strand is that you can try to reframe these hard moments in your life as in some way gifting you something, and that is often true. Sometimes it's not true. There are such things that some things do break people and can cripple you, or mentally and or physically maybe, but in most of the cases, what most people deal with, it gifts them something, some kind of fortitude, some kind of resilience, some kind of wisdom, some kind of deepening. And the other thing is, of course, is that these are also necessary steps to some greater good in the future. So there's two things for it. One is that you can see the good in the bad, and also the other thing is that the bad was a necessary step to some future good, which is what you had with your path has now led to where you are now, and you wouldn't have ended up now where you are, and unless you had gone through those in the past. And this is what Nietzsche talks about. He borrows it from the Stoics again, about this idea of Amor Fati, which is the idea of loving your fate, and loving the path which brought you to now, because there was no other path which would have brought you to now. And if you don't like where you are now, then change your path in the future. That's still to be written. But the path up to now is you. And so you have to kind of accept that, and you should love it. That's what Nietzsche said.
Well, I have this belief that, I don't know if you know much, but I have a rare condition that I was born with, and it's called Poland syndrome. So I'm missing my right pectoral muscle, 2 ribs directly behind it. And
right.
I actually grew up a lot with people telling me, like, what would you have preferred not to have had that condition? And I'm like, bang, okay, instantly hitting me with the comparison complex. Okay, here we're going to ride this train, are we? And I think about it, and then I always say to them, one, I don't know, I'm not living in an alternate universe, but also I could sit here with my condition and say everything that it ripped from me, or all of the opportunities that I didn't get because of if I hadn't had it. But I choose, and have actively chosen throughout my life, to go, what has it taught me? What has it given me? It's given me huge amounts of resilience. It's given me the ability to just find a way, literally find a way. If my body can't do something, I will find a way to do it. And so that has been able to divulge into other parts of my life. And I think when you end up getting caught into that complex of comparison, and I wish I had this over here, you actually forget what the bad thing has given you, and you can choose to find it.
As a question, did you come to that kind of like mentality yourself, or was there one person in your life that you look back on and thought I think it was often called, like, as a midwife, who brought that idea out and elicited that reframing for you? Really,
I actually didn't have anyone that. It's hard to say, actually. Maybe it was, but maybe it was like micro moments throughout my life. I don't think my parents were really good at not ever making it a thing, so they didn't pathologize it and they didn't over glorify it, which, I mean, I could go down that road in terms of where I think people are doing that a lot right now. And to the point where, I just did it myself. I was very, very introspective as a kid, and I just my goal was to essentially go, what is the character I want to be that I would feel proud of when I'm older, and then aim for that. And
You're the
how I did it.
philosopher's dream. You're the philosopher's dream. Like, that's Plato's ambition. If you sit long enough in the dark room, you can come to these gems of wisdom. It sounds like you had some. But as you mentioned, it's hard to know where a seed was planted somewhere by a teacher, by a friend, by a book, whatever, and then suddenly that tree sprouted from the seed.
I sought after a lot. So I always encourage people to do this. I was hell-bent on finding other people's ideas, whether it was through like philosophers, whether it was through other athletes, whether it was through an author, whether it was through an actor or people like that. I sought out stories from other people and wisdom from other people, to the point where if you had seen my bedroom as a kid, most people might have had like fast cars and hot girls. My walls were littered with inspirational quotes and ideas of other people, and real trials and tribulations of other people and how they'd overcome them. And then I would watch, when YouTube was kicking off, I would just watch video after video of people that had overcome. And none of that really was built on this idea of I must chase pleasure. It was, okay, here's a hardship, let's go through it, and it looks like it will give you some sort of satisfaction at the end.
It's interesting. Yeah, no, it's really interesting you say that, because I mean the internet is obviously awash with philosophical quotes and inspirational quotes as well, and I think that they obviously do make a lot of difference to a lot of people, and a lot of people do live by them, but ultimately they are somebody else's quotes and somebody else's wisdom which applies to their life as well. And I think the more difficult bit in a way, and obviously and also the more valuable bit, is going away and saying, how does that quote apply to me, or how does that wisdom apply to me, and does it apply to me? And as we mentioned earlier, there are often contradictions between these tidbits of wisdom. If I say like, be content with what you have, be grateful for what you have, but then that's also contradicts you with idea of ambition and change what you should. And I think if you have all these quotes around you and you don't apply it to your life and see, is this actually me, or is this that person who's no doubt successful, no doubt inspirational, no doubt very kind of important, but that worked for them, it might not necessarily work for me. It sounds like you've done that in some ways, like some kind of like inspirational magpie. You've picked the best bits and you've made it into a good nest, to finish the metaphor very messily.
Be careful, I don't need another nickname and be known as a magpie.
Yeah.
Pillar number 2.
Pillar number 2 is moderation, and this is again talking about contentment being a boring word. People don't like to talk about moderation, because it is boring, and also again we're living in this age of kind of ambition, and this is where I might have to digress from what you talked to. Probably Olympians and elite athletes often aren't very good at moderation. In fact, I remember reading an article a long time ago about if you look inside the Olympic Village, there's an incredible degree of obsessive compulsive disorder symptoms, and people like who are driven to the point of obsession because they don't have moderation. But then of course that is in some ways a necessary ingredient for greatness, or glory, but it's not always it's not a recipe often for happiness, because moderation is found happiness is found in the moderate path, which is found in Buddhism, it's found in Aristotle, it's found in all ranges of wisdom, and the idea that you shouldn't be one or the other, and you should find the middle ground. And it's come up even in this conversation. We've talked about this difference between contentment and ambition. The happy line is the middle line, isn't it? It's the one which oscillates between the two. And I think that's something that people should talk about a little bit more. And in fact, I don't know whether it's the nature of my audience, because I run a philosophy page, and so obviously there are people who are inclined to philosophy. Every time I post an idea which presents a false dichotomy, it says you are either type A or you are either type B. I'm very proud of my audience. I'm very happy to say that most of the comments are almost straight away saying, well, I'm both. And it's not as simple as that. In fact, almost everything in life is a spectrum. That there are very rarely things which are A or B. That's true of, I think psychology definitely, and definitely in morals and ethics as well. And to be happy, I think you should appreciate that kind of spectrum and the messiness of it, embracing the messiness of it, and that life is complicated, people are complicated, and when you put two people together in a relationship, it becomes complicated squared. It's not easy. So appreciating that, I think, is really important to happiness. So again, sorry, rambling at you.
But do you think we've kind of lost a concept of moderation with a world that's just telling us to have more, be excess and live in that way?
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a degree of that. It's the FOMO and the YOLO age, isn't it? So the idea that if you compromise in any respect, or if you're not giving 100 110% about everything, that you must therefore be failing or not living life as to your fullest. I think that's difficult for two reasons. One is that no one can do that forever. No one can be constantly intense about everything. Although that said, I rewatched a movie called Green Book. Have you seen Green Book? It's about Viggo Mortensen.
The Viggo Mortensen.
Yeah,
I can never say his surname. And the pianist.
Yes.
As his driver.
And
Great
there was
film.
a line in that. And there was a line there which has really stuck with me. I only watched this like last week. And it's where he's driving him and he says, "My dad always said to me, whatever you're doing, do it at 100%. And that line's really something because he says that, if you're eating, eat. If you're talking, talk. If you're socializing, socialize. If you're playing, play. If you're working, work. And that's really stuck with me because essentially what he's saying is, is commit to what you're doing at that time and don't worry about anything else and keep your mind at one. It's mindfulness really and really bad. But I really like that framing of it. So maybe I've within this conversation I've changed my mind about you can give 100% all the time, so long as that thing is different. I guess.
Yeah, I love that. It's a great film, but also like you said, you touched on it. It's a very mindful way of thinking. It's if anyone has dived into meditation and even trying to improve their ability to be more mindful, it is just the ability to be fully committed to whatever is your object of awareness and focus, even if it's just the next breath, right? It's just being committed to focusing on that. But even now, so for example, a recent conversation I had was with a guy called Richard Shorter, who's brands himself the non-perfect dad. And he had this great rule for his family, which was the living room is a one-screen room. And what I got from that was just so many good things, but mainly this ability to just be fully committed to this one screen. If we're watching a film together, we're watching the film. Because I think of many experiences where I have with people where the film is on and you've all said, we want to watch this film, we want to get engaged with this film, but they choose to be on their phone whilst they're doing it, and it's you're not doing it 100%. It's just an example of something where people are not 100% committed.
And I absolutely agree. And so I'm not. I use my phone a lot. I'm quite addicted to it. Obviously, it's kind of my job in some respects. But I used to do this thing when I meet with friends. We used to do this thing where people just put their phones on the table. They wouldn't be looking at them. They wouldn't be like using it. But it's a small. We talked about earlier about that distraction. That the ability to reconnect with what you're doing when you've been distracted by a phone. But just the act of putting a phone face up on the table, where on some level you are aware it's there, and yes, it probably will pop up with a notification, an email, or a message. And even if you ignore it, it's 1%, isn't it, taken away from your attention? It's we're talking about 100%. It's 1% taken away, and you're not there with the other person. But on the other hand, it is quite intense to stare at somebody and say, right, let's talk, for the next hour, and it's staring in their eyes. But then I think that's probably because we're just not used to it in our age anymore, of having proper conversations to the point where I am going to devote my entire attention to you. Simone Weil talks about it as being what's called attention. She says it's an act of love, though. Are you giving your entire 100% attention to somebody? She said that's what love means, because you are giving them your entire being over to them. You're not looking at your phone, you're not looking out the window, you're not thinking about what you want for dinner, you're not obsessing about, that's like that thing, that email at work. You're focusing on them. And I really like that idea, but I don't think I'm good at it. I don't think the society are very good at it, because I don't think we do 100% attention with people, because, as I say, it's seen as being a bit intense these days. But maybe that's what we need to bring back a little bit.
Yeah, like you say, if you're going to do something, do it 100%. And be intentional, but it's got to be the right thing, right? So from what I'm getting from the moderation pillar is that as long as you're moderating that it's the right thing, then you can kind of be all in on it.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think, and also because it doesn't. It's across a lifetime, isn't it? As well. I mean, I think I talk about this in the moderation pillar. I talked about this guy who I'm really into at the moment, a mythologist called Martin Shaw, and he talks about it as in terms of happiness, he talks about a wild self and a kind of castle self. There's when you are born, he talks about this myth where when we are all born, we have a twin, and one of which is a wild twin and one of which is a civilized twin. And then because of the world we live in at the moment, the wild twin is thrown away into the distant forest, and all we do is focus on the civilized twin, how to look nice, how to behave nice, how to say the right things and stuff. But then the wild twin still exists, and it's still in the forest, and occasionally it's just shouting your name. It's going, Lewis, Lewis, come out for a walk, mate. And you're like, shut up, I've got to do some work. Or, Lewis, come on, let's go wild swimming. And you're like, no, shut up, I need to, talk to my friends, whatever. And it never goes away. And so, and Shaw makes a point, and I kind of agree with him, really, that happiness in some respects is giving in to the voice of the wild twin. It's not becoming wild, it's not becoming constantly civilized, but it's living in that space where the two meet and kind of like occupying the moderation space. And this isn't new. It's essentially rebadging yin and yang from Taoism. The idea that there are two forces, and that happiness and fulfillment comes back, holding those two forces together. And I think that's true for most people. If we look back at lives where we've done something damaging, or someone has done something damaging or unhappy, I think it's often easy to point out moments where we have overspilled in some respects, or overbalanced. And I think rebalancing is often the case of fixing that, really. So that's my moderation pillar. Yeah.
Third pillar
is probably my most controversial one, and probably the one which has got the most kind of pushback, which is fair. And this is the idea that you cannot be happy for long unless you also have a degree of virtue and morality. Because, again...
Can you just describe what that might mean? So what would virtue mean?
So virtue means acting well, living well, being good, choosing the virtuous path. So, essentially there are, a few cardinal virtues which pop up. So I talk about this in my video, that there are certain virtues always throughout time which have always been virtues, and certain vices which have always been vices. So, for example, courage, wisdom, what's the other ones? I got humility is one, justice, kindness and justice. Yeah, so these are virtues that come up for all history philosophy speakers and philosophers. And so the idea is that you cannot be happy unless you also have a degree of virtue like this. And this is entirely Stoicism. So I didn't put this in the video. I should probably cite this now, because this is classic Stoicism, that to the world that virtue runs throughout the world, and that if you aren't virtuous, you don't kind of like tie into what is to be a human, to be a living creature, so you can't be happy. But the reason why it's controversial is that we can all point to people in our lives who are dickheads. Sorry, I don't know if you're allowed to swear on this. And they seem to be very happy. In fact, I watched Killing Eve a couple of months ago. Killing Eve, it's a BBC program about a spy.
Yes.
And there's a great line in it where one of the characters turns away and she says, "It's depressing how much you can get in life by being a dickhead." Because there's a scene where she goes up to like a receptionist and says, "I want the best room now. Give it to me. Do you know who I am?" And she gets a room. And, that is an example of kind of like, well, yeah, it does seem that, nice guys finish last, dickheads get what they want. But the idea is that all these people say that, you cannot be existentially happy unless you are kind, unless you are humble and virtuous. But this is something because the pushback has pushed me back, and I need to think about it a bit more. What are your thoughts? What do you think? How do you think happiness involves a degree of being good, or do you think you can be happy without goodness?
Yeah, I think it's so hard to say, isn't it, on an individual basis, because those who are dickheads being assholes in public, do we know if they're truly being happy because they are ostracizing themselves? I put this in a sporting context, right? I have played with some of the most famous players of my sport. I've played against them as well. And it is so surprising that how many that have made it to the top are assholes.
Yeah.
And then I've spoken to people in corporates, and the phrase that shit rises right, is a real common phrase. And you just think, wow. But at the end of it, how do we know if those people are truly happy? I've seen players, for example, that have fallen out of professional sport and then are sort of existentially met with questions as to, why is no one contacting me? Why is no one being around me? Where are my friends? What is the true meaning of sort of being happy, right? Because the sport was giving them the success was giving them the happiness, and then suddenly that's taken away, and then they're kind of left with who they are. And I don't know. The thing with virtue as well, I don't know if you've come across Will Storr.
Oh, yeah. The art
Games.
of storytelling as well. You know, that
and he wrote a book called Status Game.
Right, okay.
And he talks about in there about playing virtue games, that we are now in an age where we're playing virtue games, where my virtue is better than your virtue, and I'm more virtuous than you. And you see this really polarized on the left and the right politically in any subject. So if you think of the left being the sort of the moral it's built off sort of its moral foundation, isn't it? Of trying to be good. Like if we're leaning left, then we're trying to be always good to people and finding the moral for everyone. However, those who are the loudest speakers on the left and the ones that are the most sort of publicized and loudest speaking, their actions in themselves are not virtuous. They're acting like dickheads. And it's kind of the ones that are in the center, both center right, center left, right? They're both sort of that they do have an element of looking at the other one and understanding the other one. But the polar opposites, the ones that get the attention, they get the sort of fame, and the ones that will be put on shows, TV, their social medias will blow up because it's this, again, the media attention on something that's negative.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you can also frame so many of the political and moral debates we're having in terms of virtues, in terms of like, both left and right, whatever tribe you want to be part of, that, they have legitimate claims which make sense if you are emphasizing certain virtues. Like, so a philosopher called Alistair MacIntyre in the late 20th century talks about this in terms of like, I think he talks about, for example, private schools in the UK as an issue of this. That you could say, for example, that independence and the ability to do what you want and choose. A parent has a right to choose for their kids whatever they want. That is, as a virtue, it's a right that they have. But also, equally on the other side is the right for fairness and social justice and stuff in terms of both in doctors or in schools. So, forcing a doctor, for example, to work in the NHS rather than for private. I'm aware I've swapped from education to health, but because I think he actually talks about health. It's not fair, you're forcing someone, you're forcing them to work where you want them to work and they haven't got a choice. But on the other hand, kind of, it's not fair. So do you emphasize fairness in that or independence and choice? They're both valid positions to hold. And so the debate then comes down to what you value more in what are essentially your foundational or your starting principles, really. But I need to dig out that Will Storr kind of book. Right.
Again, it comes down to this idea that we've kind of gamified virtue.
Yeah.
Really, we have. It's not good enough to be sort of virtuous towards maybe one group and then slightly less virtuous and kind and just to another. But that just completely removes all parts of rules within the game of life that we're playing. And I remember there's a sort of a 12-minute, and for whatever people think of him, on Joe Rogan's podcast where he has Guy Ritchie on there.
Oh, right.
And I think of this, it's a great clip on YouTube where sort of Guy Ritchie goes off on a bit of a monologue for 12 odd minutes, but it's one of my favorites. But he does talk about don't hate the player, hate the game, essentially. But he says, don't do that. Don't hate the game because you're in it. So kind of play it. And I do think we have created people who have misunderstood the game of life.
Yeah, and also, sorry, no, you got...
No, it was only just the fact that people are just bouncing. They are creating this sense of, the only way for me to win now, virtuously, is to be a better virtue player than you are.
And it kind of ties into what I said a bit earlier about the second pillar in terms of like this ability to recognize that life is grey and that there is there's an element of moral ambiguity that I think the social media age has encouraged a degree of performance and a degree of like everyone has to be squeaky clean. And, what you're talking about essentially is virtue signaling in a sense. And it's really interesting. So, for example, on my Instagram, I occasionally put what I call thought experiments in ethics where, so for example, the most famous one is the trolley problem. There's a train on the track, it's going to kill 3 people. Do you pull a lever so it only kills 1 person? There is no right answer. You will kill somebody. There is always going to be it's morally ambiguous. It's grey. There's a bad answer. And so, a lot of people, rather than answer that, because it opens them up to criticism. Like, oh, you choose to kill somebody, would you? Or you'd let 3 people die. They will desperately try to break out of the thought experiment. They'll try to, as you say, break the system, break the game. They'll say, oh, it doesn't exist. It can't exist. Well, there are a few real life examples where we could imagine. But the point is that people don't want to show that they themselves have warts and all, that everybody has some kind of moral ambiguity to them, and that it's easier to shout from the sidelines, and then rather than to say, yeah, well, actually, I've made mistakes, I've done bad things, and I'm still here. Because as a society, we're very intolerant of that. Obviously in our politicians, although you could argue that it's gone the other way a little bit now, that we allow politicians to have a degree of criminality in their past, but also just generally around people. Like if we find out somebody has done something bad, then we therefore must write them out of our lives. And I often wrangle with myself about this, about friendships, for example, and loyalty. Like, it's often said with family that you have your family no matter what. That if I have a brother or a family member and let's say they kill somebody and they're in prison and they're a murderer, they're still my brother, they're still my family member. I'll probably visit them. But what about friendship? What about relationships? Like, what degree of immorality or ambiguity do you accept? And it's not an easy answer, because it's, as I say, it's this spectrum. It's not knights in shining armors and orcs forged in Sauron's mines. It's kind of like, there's something in between. What do you think about that? Where do you stand in terms of your like loyalty versus essentially, moral grandstanding?
So as you were talking, there was a former guest on the show, Cathy O'Dowd. So she is she's the first woman to summit Everest from both the north and the south side.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
And she actually has a famous story in one of her ascents, where as she was going up there was a couple that had tried to ascend Everest, and they were partners, and they had got into trouble, and the guy had actually gone down the mountain to go and try and get help, but had perished in going down. Cathy was coming down the mountain and found this woman, and I forget her name. It's Arden something. And Cathy talks about it, and Cathy's met with this decision: do I try to save this woman's life, who is dying right in front of her? She's really dying. Do I try to save this woman's life, but in the attempt of doing that, pretty much guarantee her own fate will end? Or do I leave her and get myself down the mountain? And Cathy chose to go down the mountain. And the backlash of that clip that I put on social media and that's on YouTube is incredible, of how many people virtue signal towards her making the wrong decision. And I think I've even commented on going sort of almost like thou without sin sort of can cast the first stone. Sort of. And I just can't think of a better example of someone there's a moral dilemma, but almost a logical answer to it that she must take. And is she virtuous? Is she not? And in my opinion, she kind of knew the right thing to do based off her experience, herself. She not like she didn't morally go over this dilemma, but she had to make a very quick decision. And that there will be instances of people in very, very high octane, whether it's in the army, whether it's at war, and you will hear stories of that happening. But also people who are trying to save lives. I was very fortunate as a pro athlete. We teamed up with the local fire service, and they put us through a training scenario, and they taught us how to clear buildings that were on fire and how to scan buildings for bodies and things like that. And they would openly say, we go in there, you make a cost benefit analysis as you go through. Do the men and women who are going into the building to save people, they are the highest priority because they are the ones that are trying to save everyone. But when you're in the building, do you save the 2 children that are in that bedroom over there, or do you save the mother? And you can only choose one. And they constantly have to deal with that. They would constantly have to deal with cutting people out of cars and who survived, who gets the attention first. And I remember the scene in Pearl Harbor where people were like writing on the bodies of those who are coming into hospitals like fatal, decide, and where do you draw the virtue line there?
I mean, so these real life moral dilemmas do exist, and in fact, I would argue that even they happen, almost every moment of the day. Well, not that much, but they happen, daily, without being life and death situations as well. There's lots of, and it's very easy to, as you say, to grandstand from the sidelines, to virtue signal, and to say stuff like, "Oh, it's obviously black and white." When it's obviously not black and white, it's grey, and you have your opinion, and someone else might have their opinion, and also what you might say from the comfort of your sofa commenting on TikTok is going to be very different to what you're on the top of Everest with someone dying, or your own life kind of thing. But it happens every day in every situation. Like, for example, classic example, should you stay in a relationship, for example? Like, let's say you're married and you feel like you're unhappy in a relationship. should you stay in it? Like there'll be people on who maybe even commenting on this in the future might be like, well, it's obvious you shouldn't. Obviously get divorced. But then other people will be like, well, actually, I didn't get divorced, or I stayed in an unhappy relationship for the benefit of maybe my children or some further good, maybe to look after some elderly parent, whatever, and then everything is grey and ambiguous, and people's lives are far more complicated. And having the willingness to say it's difficult, I appreciate it's difficult, I think is really important. And also with that goes a degree of forgiveness and understanding. That people, I think most people are aware that something is difficult and that they've made a hard decision and they've done something which is bad. I'm sure that this guest you had on, was wrangling about that for night after night after night. What a thing to live with, that error, that mistake, or not mistake, that decision that she made. She's going to live with that forever, and she will herself be, debating whether that was the right decision. And she doesn't need people on the sidelines to say it was an easy option, you chose wrong, kind of thing. Sorry, rambling again.
Again, the mindful approach that I think of is again just placing yourself in someone else's shoes. Like, do you know all of the information of that person, and do you know everything? And I just think of a real clip that I've just commented on recently on Instagram. It was the Boston Marathon was going on, I think, last weekend, and there was a video of a guy 200 meters from the finish line, but falls to the most dire fatigue that you see marathon runners falling, where they cannot pick themselves up. And there are marathon runner after marathon runner running the last straight of the Boston Marathon, just going after it. And there is then one guy who comes past and picks this runner up and tries to carry them over the road, over the rope, over the line. And I read the comments of people saying, I'm so sad at how many people were just running past and virtue signaling towards these people. But I wrote a comment. I said, you have to understand that all of those people have their own story.
Mm-hmm.
All of them could be the Boston Marathon is one of the hardest marathons to get into, because you have to have run a sub 3 or 3:30 marathon. So you have to be a really good runner. But those people would have sacrificed so much. They would have potentially be committing to a reason bigger than themselves as to why they're running that marathon. Maybe they had a goal and ambition they were chasing, and they may have been so single focused going down that last straight, they may not have even seen that person that was collapsed. But this one guy did, and he stopped, and he got the praise of it. Rightly so. He did a great thing. He put his own goals aside to help this one individual. But I don't think it meant that you had to cast a stone on every single person going past, thinking they were morally corrupted and they were morally bad.
I agree. And there's almost two things I want to say about that, really. The first thing is that I've appreciated far more recently since having children, actually, and it's possibly says something about my naivety, or I didn't think about this issue enough. But seeing young children and seeing how changeable they are, even so, my eldest is only nearly 6 now, and already within his class there are personality differences, different attitudes to other people, moral decisions, which I would call moral decisions. And to think that anyone is born evil, for example, or anyone is born malicious, whatever and stuff, and to see the path that people start from so early, ending up a certain direction. We were talking earlier about the past, weren't we, and stuff. And as you mentioned, on the Boston Marathon, they're all full of people who were once babies who then became marathon runners, and there is a path from that to this. And so, and to ignore that path is to kind of ignore their humanity, because if you don't, no one is dropped in this planet right now, right here, with a brain as a moment that kind of leads up to it. And the second thing I want to say is something, again, which I've been thinking about recently, is the degree of what I sometimes call the suffering competition. And this is this idea that that just because there are people in this life who have been marginalized and abused and are suffering to a huge extent, that we shouldn't appreciate and recognize the suffering of other people as well. There's a degree of kind of, so again, I've talked about this philosopher called Schopenhauer, and he says eventually that all life is suffering, which is depressing and some they're pessimistic. But he essentially argues that everyone is going through something. Everyone has got some issues, and just because there are people who are dying from starvation or people who are being murdered and raped, whatever, doesn't mean that other people aren't suffering, and doesn't mean that you shouldn't talk about their suffering. And I think, when we don't recognize that everyone is going through something, I think it leads to a lack of empathy on everyone's part, but also the feeling that you are being ignored and you are being not listened to, and that you are cast out by society, that your suffering somehow isn't important. So I think those two things are going on as well in that thing. And again, I don't know kind of where that fits into what we're saying.
I spoke at one of the UK's most prestigious schools. It's a school where teachers having to sign NDAs because of the kids that they are teaching are from such high-profile families. And when I went in there, I was really keen on asking the deputy head teacher about the mental health that was going on within the school. And I said, what is the state of mental health within this school? And he said a line that just stuck with me. He said, our privilege doesn't protect us. And he said that you would think on the outside that because these kids come from wealthy families, because they have everything sort of materialistically that everyone is seeking and wants, that these kids are free from struggle and from mental health issues. He said quite the opposite. We meet every marker, if not go over it, comparative to everyone else in the UK. The only thing that does protect us is the fact that we have the funds to be able to create support internally than have to go to a system that's run governmentally. But the line of our privilege doesn't protect us just hit me like a sledgehammer, because I realized that these kids are just kids, and the feeling of anxiety, like anxiety doesn't care about what it is that you're worrying about it or that you're marinating over. It just gives you anxiety. But the difference in the issues for kids that come from state schools to this really high profile private school, the mental health issues that they were facing was almost completely the same.
Yeah. Well, I used to work in one of those schools. And yeah, I used to teach, what you definitely, would call privileged children. But because as you mentioned earlier before we came on, I did my teacher training down in Brighton, and I spent a lot of time in Brighton. And I remember some of my Brighton friends at the time, they so hated the private school system that some of the things they would say about private school children were just so cruel and mean. And I had to say to them a few times that, they are wealthy. They've got wealthy households. They come from undoubted privilege. But these are children with issues and problems and stuff. And you're just being really mean to these people. And, and the lack of empathy shown to people who somehow don't come somewhere on a suffering chart or a suffering table, that just because they haven't got these issues or those issues, or their issues are only, let's say, -3, they're not -10. So let's not appreciate their issues. There's something inhumane about it, something like lacking in empathy, and it's awful. I find it really hard, and actually a lot of people I'm no longer friends with, because I think it revealed an underlying willingness to fail to see the human. You're losing the woods from the trees kind of thing there a little bit.
Look, this conversation is something that I've really looked forward to having, and there's so many areas I want to go into, so I want to be very conscious of your time. I would love to get you back on to talk about relationships, love, and all of that. So I would love to put a part 2 together, essentially, and rerun this.
Well, I like that, yeah. And I'm in the process of, as I say, pitching and soon to be writing book 4. So I'd love to come on and definitely plug that when it's off to the printers as well.
Beautiful. So one thing just to finish off that I'm really curious about from your own personal side is you've studied hundreds of years of philosophy, lots of books that you've gone through. Is there any lessons or ideas that have stayed with you the longest?
That's difficult. Very difficult. It's difficult because I am a very bad philosopher, in the sense that I often am easily swayed by whoever I'm talking to or whatever book I'm reading at the time. So we talked about magpies earlier. I'm a philosophical magpie. I will read a book about Taoism, for example, by Alan Watts, which I just finished recently, and I'll be like, I'm a Taoist. I love this. This is brilliant. Amazing. And then tomorrow I'll reread Aristotle, or in the future I'll reread Alistair McIntyre, whatever stuff, or Hannah Arendt, and I'll be like, yeah, these guys are right. So, I do find gems of wisdom, as I mentioned in my video about these pillars. So in terms of like committing myself to one philosophical school or one kind of idea, not easily, not often, but one thing I do see a lot coming up, and I try to apply in my life, is the reason why I don't want to talk about it is because mindfulness is such a cliche now. Even talking about mindfulness is annoying. But the sense of egolessness and focusing on what you're doing, that crops up a lot, and I think there's something to be had in that. And as I say, that maybe that Green Book video, you talked about, like, the right thing at the right time. Moving to Spain was, the right path. It was the right journey for you right now. And I think maybe interestingly, watching that Green Book at this time in my life with that quotation jumped out at me, and maybe there's something to be said in that, really. So a conclusion which kind of like summarizes the rest of the podcast really well. I've been rambling and utterly unable to answer your question. So sorry.
And if people are feeling essentially deeply unhappy or maybe a bit lost right now, is there something that you would suggest for them to go towards or start with, whether it's a book, train of thought, or philosophy that potentially is a great beginning point for them?
Unhappiness, difficult, I think, in terms of, like, I would, so if someone's going on an unhappy period, I would read like someone like Michel Montaigne, for example. He wrote these essays. The reason why I said that, actually, ought to be honest, literature and autobiographies or people's lives, because as we mentioned throughout this entire podcast, I think people are going through things and people's lives are complicated. And I think reaching into somebody else's mind and hearing their stories really grounds what you're going through as well. And also that there's a great comfort and motivational heft. We talked about motivation earlier, about hearing other people go through things. And this is why your podcast is great as well, because you talk to people who have come through things. And I think listening to podcasts like this helps normalize hardship, normalize challenge, normalize the human condition, which I think we don't get a lot of on social media, because it's an artificial, abnormal space. It is from Black Mirror, but it's becomes it's an Instagram and Reels and the happy culture, and it's become so normalized we don't appreciate it. So yeah, again, another non-answer for you, but I would say that read something which it connects you with another human being. And if that's not reading, do it yourself. Go and talk to people, I'd say.
Love it. Yeah, I don't think something we haven't spoken about is the amount of deep conversations that I think people couldn't be having.
This comes up again and again with my community as well, because people aren't religious in my community, and they say, like, the church used to be a place where you could talk about deep things and people wouldn't call you a weirdo, and we don't have that space. Sorry, I interrupted you. That's really rude of me. You were saying?
No, that's it. My thinking is that I have been branded as someone who thinks too deeply, and I always sit there and think internally, I don't feel like I think deeply enough.
Yeah.
And for me, the best conversations, the best answers I've had in my life have come from the deepest and the best questions that I can think of. It's like the quality of your life is determined on the quality of your questions.
Yes, and I have to thank you for that.
Asking them.
I have to thank you because, over the course of this conversation, I have clarified my thoughts as well, and I've unearthed thoughts or ideas that I need to explore more as well, and want to explore. So, yeah, you have an art of being able to have those conversations. So, thank you for that. That's important.
Well, appreciate that, Jonny. It's really kind of you. Where's the best place to send people to keep up to date with what you're doing, and where should we send them?
Insta probably, or Substack. I'm trying to grow my Substack at the moment, but then everyone and their dog is on Substack at the moment, so I'm conscious I don't want to say it too much. But yeah, Instagram is where you can find me, message me. I'm fairly responsive to messages, but Substack if you like reading stuff, but Instagram if you want to see my face every other day. Really
brilliant.
Thanks, man.
Jonny. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonny Thomson.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed that episode with Jonny and you want to enjoy even more episodes of the show, then I've put together a playlist for you to get started with right away. All you have to do is click right here. Go on,